Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening to support A Better Chance and its incredibly important mission to develop well-educated young people of color who can grow into our future leaders. Now more than ever, we need strong leaders in the fight for a more just and equal society. I'm Bertha Coombs, and I'm joined with other A Better Chance alumni. I am an alum of Milton Academy, class of 1980. Tonight, we're kicking off A Better Chance's new initiative, Creating Leaders for a Lifetime, designed in response to the cancellation of the Better Chance annual awards luncheon, one of the year's major fundraising events in normal times. Creating Leaders for a Lifetime's three components this year: the Alumni Showcase, virtual luncheon, and the virtual auction. Through those, we aim to raise the critical operating support A Better Chance needs to address the current $1 million revenue gap head on. For tonight's inaugural session of the Alumni Showcase, we brought together some of our community's best and brightest to examine the state of American civil rights activism and engagement in 2020. Between the COVID pandemic, which has laid bare health and economic disparities in the Black and Hispanic communities, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the international outcry over the deaths of Black Americans at the hands of excessive force by the police, we really haven't seen such wide-scale social activism in more than 2 generations, certainly not in this country. The big question we all have is whether this social engagement will lead to real and sustainable change. We've got an incredible panel tonight to talk about it. They're all alumni of A Better Chance who dedicate their work to civil rights and the law. Let's start with our first panelist, Debo Degbile. He's a Fieldstone class of 1984. Debo, why don't you tell people a little bit about yourself?
Terrific. Thanks so much, Bertha. It's great to be here tonight and with the ABC family. I was a Fieldstone class of 1984 and a proud ABC scholar. After high school, I took a break and then went to Connecticut College and graduated from Connecticut College and then on to NYU Law School. And I've worked as a lawyer in the private sector in large law firms for many years at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, where I served as litigation director for many years and as acting president and director counsel. And then I worked on the Hill for the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee before coming back to WilmerHale, where I'm now the co-chair of the Anti-Discrimination Practice Group. And I also serve on the United States Civil Rights Commission as a presidential appointee. Barack Obama appointed me shortly before he left office in 2016. It's great to be with you.
Terrific. Next to you on screen, we've got Sharia Smith. She is a graduate of the Hotchkiss School, class of 2001. Sharia.
Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Sharia Smith, like Bertha just said. I'm a native of Gary, Indiana. Went to Hotchkiss straight out of 8th grade, so from 9th through 12th grade, then on to Harvard University. And after Harvard, I did 2 years with Teach for America, where I taught in South Texas, right on the border of Texas and Mexico. I taught 5th grade, and then went into law school. Based on an essay about wanting to affect education policy, but it took me some time to actually get to that work. After I graduated from law school, I clerked for some federal judges, worked at Big Law, paid off my student loan debt, and civil rights attorney at the U.S. Department of Education. I was there for about 4 years. In that role, though, a role that I think is actually pretty exciting that I always talk about as much as I can. I'm now the national president of our labor union, and I represent almost 3,000 employees, bargaining unit employees in the United States Department of Education, and fight to retain an independent federal workforce that works for this country, and our citizens, and fighting for retaining the ability for people to enter into the federal workforce and establish themselves into the middle class.
Terrific. And finally, we have Professor Jody Armour of Lower Merion, A Better Chance class of 1978. Jody, take it away.
Yeah, it's really great to be with the ABC family again. And my story really starts, my ABC story starts before ABC with the loss of my dad to the criminal justice system Family separation has been going on as part of the criminal justice system for a lot of decades. I lost him for 22 to 55 for possession and sale of marijuana. He taught himself the law and appealed his way out eventually, but in the meantime, we went from a middle-class standard of living to crumbs and roaches and rats. And that's, I would have stayed mired in that situation, but for a better chance, you know, which was a real serious intervention that made a world of difference for me. Many of the folks really the vast majority of the guys I was running with in those days wound up in jail on probation or on parole.
Wow.
That's the point. So,
an amazing story.
So that's what kind of got me into law, into a better chance. From there, I went to Harvard, Berkeley Law, and now all I do is scholarship because my dad showed me the power of word work. All he had was language, and the next thing you know, his own jailhouse door was opening, from stuff he learned in the warden's own law books.
Well, we are going to have a great discussion, but before I begin, I'd like to take one moment to recognize our sponsors. Thank you to the Costas Family Foundation, Deloitte, DuPont, Henry R. Kravis, Lori and Peter Allen Atkins, Ronald and Mary Pressman, Skadden Arps, Slate, Meager, and Flom, Stanley Black and Decker, and Trio Killian, who is an ABC alum from the Hill School class of 1970. Thanks to all of you for making this event possible and for securing a better chance for the next generation. So let's get started. And, you know, Sharia, I want to start with you because you're the youngest of us here. And, you know, I remember, I would imagine that Jody remembers and Debo remembers. I remember as a child seeing people going out and marching. I remember, you know, seeing the signs of the workers in 1968 in Memphis who Martin Luther King had gone to help to secure better working rights for sanitation workers. They would have signs that said, "I am a man." Mm-hmm. And now here we are 50 years later, and people are saying Black Lives Matter. Does this resonate for you? And I'm wondering, when you saw the outpouring this summer of people around the world taking up this cause, did it give you hope? Did it give you distress? What did you feel as someone who's taken on this work of civil rights as your vocation?
Yeah, it actually gave me some distress. It distressed me because it indicated to me that the work that had been done that you just mentioned, beginning of the 1960s, that not much has changed since then. In fact, we've regressed as a country. You know, I you know, just in my opinion, the fact that I still have this work, one of the reasons why, you know, a better chance is still so important. It's because, you know, the ideals that we thought we had, you know, completed as a country, you know, with Brown versus Board of Education, with the marching and the civil rights movement in the 1960s, has not yet materialized into any type of permanency. And so we have, you know, people taking to the streets again on just such a basic level. You know, it's basically the equivalent of "I am a man," like I matter. And that really shouldn't even be a debate, but it is. I also grew troubled by the co-option of the Black Lives Matter movement. I think the people I saw on the streets were on the streets for reasons I think are more related to COVID and economic unrest. But we're under the banner, for good or for bad, Black Lives Matter. I don't think it's entirely a bad thing that we have so many people there. I wonder if Black Lives Matter to everyone there, you know, aren't we hearing more about dismantling this pervasive myth of Black inferiority? You know, why aren't we accompanying it with economic talks? Why is it just limited to police reform, which I think is part of an issue, but a smaller part of the issue? So I appreciate you for recognizing my youth. I don't get to be the youngest often, but I'm less hopeful than I would like to be.
Jody, what about you? You have a long view, and certainly with your own story. Do you feel like this has just been a sort of performative exhale on people's part? Or do you think people are also getting at some of the systemic issues and starting to really acknowledge some of the systemic issues that have been with us for so long?
Well, out here in LA anyway, when we've been having the discussions, it's gone beyond just police brutality, although that's been a central part of the discussion. And what we've started to do with our calls for unbundling the police is to try to shrink the footprint of law enforcement so that resources can go into safety in the form of jobs and adequate housing and adequate schools. You know, you can prevent crime on the front end that way by allocating those resources in that way, rather than as you know, kind of as we saw happen roughly around the same time in America, we started shredding the social safety net. We started spending more on prisons and police, right? We decided that, you know, fortunately, ABC programs, there was a time in the 60s, Great Society programs, when we felt confident about making real interventions and changing the world and moving the needle. And we are blessed by that vision the folks had back then. But a lot of people lost that along the way. And they started saying, we'll spend on jails and prisons and police officers instead. We'll let the social problems fester and, you know, kind of get too bad to the point that we have something real serious happen. So I like that we are thinking along those lines again. And the only thing that has put us in this position, then I'll stop, to start thinking along these lines, which is going to be a little more optimistic. I got to have some reason for optimism to roll out of bed in the morning.
Thank you.
is because partly as a result of those 6 weeks of marching, you know, unremittingly, you know, making the claim statement again and again that Black Lives Matter and staying on message over and over. They did kickstart a lot of discussions about defunding the police, unbundling the police. We're having serious discussions about that in LA now, and up in San Francisco and all throughout California, and I expect a lot of other places. So, you know, I do see that silver lining.
You know, one of the things that I find, I cover business news, and one of the things that I found is listening to business leaders saying they want to take up this issue, whether it is funding more groups that do social engagement, or really trying to put their money behind basically social determinants, economic determinants, health determinants, and things like that. Debo, you know, you are often involved in the front lines of fighting for these issues in the courts. Are we going to continue to see these court battles happening? And given the fact that we may see a sea change now in the Supreme Court, what is that going to mean for this momentum that we're seeing right now?
So obviously, the courts play an important role in navigating the disputes in the areas of civil rights and in mediating progress of the activists and the brave people that come forward to push the envelope in recent decades, really to try and mostly defend ground that had been captured in the fight against injustice and racial discrimination in a whole lot of areas. So many of the efforts recently have been trying to stop an effort at going backward, as opposed to continuing to expand, although there are pieces of both things that happen in the courts. And I think the challenge is that the courts are very rarely the front line of change. I think that some of the movements and efforts in the streets that we've been talking about are some of the things that create a context for change to happen and sort of bubble up a focused effort at meeting an injustice that is perceived and experienced by a lot of people. And then lawyers can play a role in trying to lift up the voices and the cause of those folks. But it's challenging when you have courts that may not always be looking to plow new ground in that area. And indeed, some courts that are looking to narrow things, whether it's in the area of voting or other areas. We're seeing challenges in access to higher ed. There are challenges in housing, and there's sort of a mix of things that are coming together. And so I think that pressure from folks on the ground demanding justice, demanding that the country live up to its promise of equality, that, you know, one of the ways to regard the history of the United States is that we began with the Constitution with high promises of equality for everybody, or at least it moved to that as the Constitution was amended. But too often what we've had are low practices. And one of the ways to think about civil rights is as a concerted effort to narrow the gap between our high promises and what are too often low practices. That's the way I regard my efforts through the years. And I think that that's an effort that requires a lot of people doing a lot of different things in order to ensure that progress is made. And sometimes again, when we face retrenchment.
You know, it's the journalist in me that just wonders, with the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, it looks as though we could see another jurist added before the election, certainly before the new year, likely be very conservative, and switch the entire balance of the high court. Again, I think of usually these cases heading up to the highest court of the land. And for the last 50, 60 years, it's been fairly balanced in that you always sort of have one swing vote in the middle that might weigh in on one thing or another. So most cases are 5-4. In this case, what's your sense, Debo? How would that impact cases that are coming up? I know I cover healthcare, and a lot of folks think it could have a major impact on upcoming healthcare cases like the Affordable Care Act that's due to be heard just after the election.
So there are predictions about what a new justice on the court would do, and sort of received wisdom. I think Justice Stevens said before he resigned that in his many years, I think over 30 years on the court, that he once observed that every justice that replaced the predecessor was sort of more conservative than the predecessor, and he observed this pattern, right? And so I think on one level, yes, there is a middle of the court somewhere, but one question you have to ask is, where is that middle? Is that middle in some middle that captures a broad understanding, or has the middle itself adjusted to one side or another? And I think that's part of the question, not just asking who's in the middle, but asking objectively, where is the middle, and what are the issues that we're deciding and trying to protect. More broadly, I guess what I would say is there are things that are foreseen and there are things that are unforeseen. And so right now we're talking about healthcare. Obviously, there's a lot of concern about what the future of healthcare is in the high court, but then there is also these realities in the world, right? And one of the realities in the world is that public health is now a threat to the global universe, right? I guess those are a little bit inconsistent. The universe is the universe, the globe is the globe, every nation in the globe, right? We're understanding that public health is a matter of national security, it's a matter of economic security, and that in order to protect the lives that we are trying to achieve, although there's tremendous inequality in the United States, and certainly not everybody has equal opportunity. But in order to sort of have a system that is any semblance of the system that we've had in the United States and in other places, thinking about how we react to global pandemics and access to healthcare is now been driven home in a way that perhaps when we were talking about the last case in healthcare coming to the Supreme Court, we didn't understand. So part of the conversation is, are we going to continue to see things in the same way, or are there pressures? Is there some context that's going to be
So
added?
when you say we, you think about the social context outside of the court, not necessarily just the letter of the law and what they might decide with regard to that, the ruling that is at stake.
I think that's right, but in part, the reason I say that is because sometimes the court is the last word, but sometimes it's not the last word. one of the things that Ruth Bader Ginsburg did famously is that she wrote powerful dissents. And the reason she wrote those dissents is because she sometimes was encouraging folks, the legislature, Congress, to make sure that whatever the perceived injustice was in the case in front of her was actually not the last word, and that there would be another chapter, right? And so part of what I'm suggesting is that in the democracy, there's a dialectic. There's a conversation that happens between the legislative branches and the court. And we have seen through history that there are these external pressures that sometimes impact what the worldview is in the court. It doesn't mean that there's a guarantee in any particular case in the moment, but it does mean that over time, things that were regarded in one way in a particular moment may be regarded in another way in the next moment, because sometimes you have to take cognizance of those facts that you were once able to ignore.
Things don't remain static, at least not for long. You know, what's interesting is fascinating for me talking with all of you. When I was going through ABC, my thought was that I wanted to go to Harvard Law School, and that, or maybe Yale, and that maybe I wanted to become a lawyer up on Capitol Hill and fight for civil rights and do that and be involved in the political process. Once I worked on a campaign, somewhere along the line, I decided that it was more fun to be a journalist than to actually be a lawyer. And plus the idea of law school just seemed too much for me. But I wonder, you know, Sharia, if you were a student now, do you think you'd still want to pursue law? And for students who might be listening tonight, what are some of the things they can do if they want to engage and they want to pursue a career or vocation of civil rights and engagement?
Yeah, I think that you thought rightly about your career decision, because I do think the media does drive how people think about things and the worldview. You know, I'd always wanted to be a lawyer, and I had a thought before I entered law school, and certainly before I entered the practice of law, which I do love, about I had a perception of how powerful lawyers are, and perhaps I just haven't, I haven't had that experience yet. But the work that we do, I really do feel as if I am trying to fill a champagne flute with a fire hose. You know, we are limited. One thing, the work that we do is very reactive. So we don't really act on things unless people bring things to us. In the Office for Civil Rights, you generally don't have what you might envision as the people coming to our office, the disenfranchised, underserved. And I think that's because the disenfranchised and the underserved aren't really told that they have an area of redress. So we have a different type of population that comes and seeks our intervention in their issues. And we are reactive. And those things that we receive in our office, that's just the tip of the iceberg. We don't really know what is out there. There are a lot of things that our office cannot do, where the media, people come to me all the time. There are a whole bunch of dreadlock cases from schools where we're being represented. Yeah, based on their
harassed because of their haircut,
their natural hair. And a lot of my friends are just like, what are you guys doing about that? Well, the answer is nothing. Policy doesn't allow us to, the way we interpret Title VI, which is the laws on the book that protect against discrimination based on race and national origin, not interpret those laws in such a way that encompasses hairstyles. So we don't do anything about an issue that our brothers and sisters in the media have let people know is a concern. And so I don't know if I do enjoy law. I think the law has given me an education about what is possible and what else needs to be done. I think if I could do it again, I would probably pursue a career in finance. I do think even above the media, it is, financial giants that run the world, and they employ people to help us perceive things in ways that might be more beneficial to whatever their bottom line is. I do find them to be maybe the puppet masters. But
or
again,
in some cases, change agents as well.
Yeah, and exactly. I mean, puppet master is good or bad. I say that without, I guess that does have a negative.
It sounds a little pejorative.
Yeah, but they're change agents, you know, for better or worse.
Now, Jody, you know, as we talk about making change, you focus on the law, and now you focus on writing. What are some of the ideas you think people need to grasp in terms of trying to close this achievement gap once and for all? Do you see a real opportunity now? I feel as though people who I will let you know that I've talked to executives, white executives, who sort of taken me aside and they said, you know, I never knew that my Black manager didn't take the trash out at night because he didn't want to be stopped in his own neighborhood, well-to-do neighborhood, for questioning. Or he doesn't walk his dog too late at night either, certainly not with a hoodie over his head. He was just astounded to hear these things. And that gives me a little hope that people are listening and they are trying to sort of grapple and understand that there are profound differences that people of color experience regardless of their economic status.
Yeah, and I think, you know, a lot of my early scholarship was writing about racial profiling, what I call the black tax, and strenuously opposing it, of course. But there's a silver lining in it. And that'd be odd to hear for coming from me, given my earlier writing. But there is a silver lining in the black tax in this sense. I've had neighbors of mine here in View Park, which LA Times called Black Beverly Hills in LA. You put View Park, Windsor Hills, Baldwin Hills, and Ladera Heights together, you got one of the largest upper middle class areas in the country. And I've had neighbors, when my son's friends were visiting them from their basketball, baseball, football teams from other neighborhoods, tell me, we don't want Compton up here. We don't want South Central up here.
And that's both people of color and...
It was all black neighborhood.
Huh.
It's a Black Beverly Hills, right? This is kind of, you know, kind of the gated community, economically gated community mentality that I've seen among, you know, the Black bourgeoisie. You know,
yeah.
And since I'm coming as an ABC student, I'm coming from truly disadvantaged background, but I'm in situations in which a lot of people aren't coming from those backgrounds. Mm-hmm. I'm able to see how they're treating people from the background I'm from. You know, when they say they don't
and are they conscious of it? Do they realize what they're saying?
No. They kind of realize it to this extent, but they don't care about it. They don't realize, they don't understand that when they say they don't want Compton up here, they don't want me up here because I'm basically Compton up here. You know, I'm basically South Central up here, you know, and Watts up here. And they don't quite get that. No, they think that they are just practicing rational profiling. They're being perfectly rational. There's a statistically rational relationship between neighborhood and risk of crime, they would say. These same Black Brahmins, by the way, who rail against racial profiling when it's practiced against them on those same statistical grounds, practice spatial profiling on their own Black brothers and sisters, right, here on economic grounds. So
wait, so where's the silver lining? Because that sounds like a pretty dark cloud to me.
Here's the silver lining. The silver lining is this. Every time the black tax strikes one of these Black Brahmins up here, one of these members of the Black bourgeoisie, when they, you know, the rage of the privileged class. Ellis Coles wrote a book a long time ago about, you know, Black doctors and lawyers feeling rage because they're getting profiled and upset about it. Every time it strikes, they should have a moment of zen. They should go into a moment of zen and think about why they're being profiled and recognize that the reason they're being profiled is because people can say there's a statistically rational relationship between race and a risk of crime that I'm worried about. And that's there because blacks are disproportionately concentrated in desperate circumstances, poverty, right? You take a group of people, you disproportionately concentrate them in desperate circumstances. It's sad but not surprise you to find them disproportionately turning to desperate undertakings like crime. So if you want to get rid of the black tax and being racially profiled as a black middle-class person, you better do something to lift truly disadvantaged blacks out of criminogenic conditions that have them disproportionately turning to crime and therefore supporting statistical generalizations that give rise to the racial profiling.
Groups like A Better Chance help the really talented young people. How do we get continued momentum in helping people whose talents may not lie in academics, who are okay working what is now our essential job, but they just want a decent wage? I know it's a big question, but what sort of things, what sort of things through social engagement can this social engagement bring about? I mean, one of the things I've seen is the pressure on a lot of these retailers that paid, pretty crummy wages to raise their wages before because they were competing in a tight job market, and now because they need to hold on to these workers in the pandemic. You want to make sure that you hold on to people, and there seems to be this movement to try to do the right thing. Do you feel like maybe we're starting to turn a corner a little bit?
Man, that's a big question, Bertha. I will say I have a lot of friends from non-Black friends that have come to me and asked, so what can I do to help? And for people who are from the Judeo-Christian background, it might sound similar to the parable of Jesus, where the rich man said, how do I enter the kingdom of? Then Jesus gave him the answer. They're like, I don't. And so the answer I give is, they're asking what organizations they can donate to, all that stuff. And I say to them, well,
A Better Chance, I hope, is the first thing you say to them.
Obviously, yes,
right?
obviously.
As big a check as you can to A Better Chance.
Yes. And because I think the alternatives that I give them, the things I think would actually change the needle even more than A Better Chance, are that because of this pervasive myth of, I said Black inferiority, but I think it's poor inferiority. They are unwilling to do, and that is to move into a neighborhood where that's majority Black and brown. Send your kids to those schools. The retort is always, those schools are bad schools. And I'd like to challenge that, what we think of as good and what we think of as bad, it's really just very classist in its terminology. And, I can say that from my personal experience. I'm from Gary, Indiana, predominantly Black town, predominantly working class. And when I left Gary to go to Hotchkiss, and I think every Black student who enters into a predominantly white space,
culture shock.
Yeah, not only a culture shock, but you get this dialogue, the sense that you don't belong, or you took a spot or something like that. And I was able to challenge those types of discussions with my own personal history, because the elementary school that I attended was called Banneker Achievement Center. It was the #1 school in the state of Indiana, which is not a state known for its, very large African-American population. And so that data point alone helped me challenge what people were trying to tell me were facts, were good or what's bad. Even this term achievement gap, what I am so dumbfounded to, what I'm always confused about is why we don't talk about how many, how kids performed on the SAT, based on race. Why don't we ever talk about how often certain kids from different races took the SATs to get the scores that they actually, kids are getting 1600s. Well, how many administrations of the SAT did it take for them to actually get that 1600 when you're comparing them to the Black kids who might have taken that SAT only once and got 1,000? So we're not using actual real controls, and we're not challenging, the terminology that we use when we talk about good schools, when we talk about bad schools. And I always say to these people who said, "What can I do to help?" I say, put your kids in that school, because if you put your kids in a school, that school will not fail, because you won't allow your children to attend.
Basically, to bring that rigor that you have to
right,
these
bring it up.
communities.
You get the parent teacher fundraisers. You get the very things that you do in rich communities. As someone who is rich or upper middle class, bring those resources into that school. You have a personal investment. So you don't have to ask someone that doesn't even live in your community, but who just happens to be Black, what you can do, because you're living in it. But I think that is something people are unwilling to do, but luckily they're more willing to write a check to ABC, a check, figure out Black Lives Matter. And, that's the reason why ABC still needs to exist. I definitely want people to continue writing those checks until we get to a point in our society where we don't automatically judge poor and brown communities as bad. We aren't there yet. We're nowhere near there. And that's why, a better chance needs to continue to exist.
And Deba, when it comes to education, what can some of our students do to promote greater equity and promote these issues? I guess in some senses it can become the black tax when you have to carry the flag if you're one of the few students of color at some of these schools. But knowing what you know now, what would you do if you were a student at one of these schools to try to keep these issues alive and make sure that it's not just was the summer of protest and now we're going to move on?
Right. So everybody, I think, has to face it in their own way and decide how they're prepared to engage. But I remember as I was going through school, what mattered to me was I knew that in some ways I had been very lucky to have been tapped to have the opportunities that I had, and that it was not so much that I was extraordinary as it was that things broke in my way, and that some doors opened for me, and that people invested in me, and that people cared about me in a way that created an ability for me to cultivate such ability as I had. But there were other kids on the block who had what I had or more that didn't have the same ability. So when I went off to fancy schools and had that opportunity, I tried to remain proximate to the good fortune that I had found as a way to navigate the difference between where I was sitting and where I had come from, and to make the experience feel authentic and okay that I had the gift of this opportunity. I did things on the front line to remember those around me and to engage. I worked and led the tutorial program in college, recruiting my peers to go into the public school and to help folks with their academics and to try and broaden the experience between the town and gown so that people could understand something about educational inequality and create an opportunity and be a role model for somebody else. And I worked in the public defender's office, understanding that as an intern in those days, to learn something about the criminal justice system, learn from the lawyers there, and to see something about what inequality looked like in the criminal justice system so that I could have more information about what the opportunities were to me and what the small differences. Sometimes the small differences were between where I was sitting and other people were sitting. And so sometimes what you have are people that are trying to have a different seat in the pyramid. They're trying to be in a different place. And so some of the folks that Jody may have mentioned, they wanted to be a different place in the pyramid. They wanted to be on the top, and perhaps they didn't want anybody reminding them from whence they came, or that there are other folks like them that are in a different position. But sometimes there are those that want to fight to change the number of spots at the top of the pyramid, that want to make the room bigger. And I find value in engaging in these issues, not just so I can pay my rent or I can have a comfortable life or my kids can have a comfortable life, but so I can use such ability as I have to do that, to be sure, but also to try and think about those that I may be able to affect in light of the blessings that I've had, in light of the opportunities I've had, to be a voice for the voiceless in some way. And you don't have to be a lawyer to do that. You can be in a corporation and do that for the new person that's coming in the door. You can be in an educational institution and do that for folks that are coming in. You can do it for the first generation kid who knows nothing about high school or college. You can do it for the kid at the boarding school who doesn't know all of the fancy traditions of Choate and perhaps came from an inner city situation, and just treat people with the respect and to learn from what they have to add and view them as somebody that's coming to bring their attributes, not to share deficits, but to bring their attributes that may tell you something about who you are.
You know, I'm going to confess to y'all, my family is first generation. I was born in Cuba. We came over when I was 4. So I always have this feeling of people who are immigrants, people who come from a economically disadvantaged background. We're a little more ornery. Those of us who just keep pushing forward to succeed and pushing forward to help others succeed because we're not happy with the status quo and we want to move forward. And I think everyone I've ever met from ABC has that within them. And I'm a little biased in that those are the people I gravitate more toward because they've worked for it and they've recognized that effort in other people. I didn't mean to preach there, but that's often how I feel when I meet other people who have gone through that struggle. They understand it. So I don't really understand the bougie, don't let those people come in, close the gate behind me kind of experience, Jody. I'd imagine that you probably don't have much patience for that.
I don't have a lot of patience for it either, but it's a rampant attitude, unfortunately, and it's one that we have to get to the bottom of, and ABC helped to turn my fortunes around, and I often wonder where I would have wound up. And I kind of always come to a grim conclusion when I'm thinking back on a lot of that, and then start wondering, then why can't we kind of spread those opportunities to more people? A lot of my work now is about, and let me just say this, and to kind of chime with what you said, that a lot of times when we're talking about people from socially marginalized groups, so let's say we're talking about Black lives and them mattering, which has been the kind of the cry in the streets over the summer. A lot of times we spend a lot of time talking about the burdens of Blackness, the burdens of our being a member of a socially marginalized group. And we don't therefore spend any or much time talking about the blessings. A lot of times we have to talk about the burdens because there are so many people who still don't believe that, for example, Black people are burdened in America. I look at these polls and, in 2019, 18, you had up to 56 to 57% of white Americans saying that there's no longer any discrimination against Blacks in America in 2018, 19, right? So that's why we often spend so much time talking about the burdens just to establish that reality so we're all in the same social reality, but it means it takes up all the oxygen and we don't get to talk about the blessing. One of the blessings of Blackness for me as a scholar has been, it's contributed to the latest book I wrote behind me, N*GGA Theory, Race, Language, Justice, and the Law. The reason I wrote that book and was able to dive into it in the way I was is because I am a Black scholar from the experience I'm coming from. And I was able to draw on that. And, Du Bois talks about dual consciousness, he talks about, especially Black folk having to have a dual consciousness. One, and I think this can apply to other groups, so I'm going to zero in on Black folk. One, you have to master the dominant culture because you have to be able to negotiate it to be successful. And then you have to master your own because you gotta love your people. You're living with your folk, right? So you bring a dual perspective to problems anytime you're coming up on them. And dual perspectives, that's binocular disparity. If you look at anything with binocular disparity, you're going to see more nuance. You're going to have more depth perception than someone who lacks multiple perspectives that they can bring to bear simultaneously on a subject. And I do that in my scholarship all the time. And it's what makes my scholarship, I think, the kind of scholarship that people keep inviting me to write more of and speak about, right, is because it's because of the blessings of Blackness, the blessings of, of social marginality, not trying to give short shrift to the burdens, because they are many and varied, but there are many blessings too.
If I could piggyback on that, I don't know if I was thinking about, what ABC gave to me, and it made me bilingual. Not in, another tongue, but bilingual in the language of the working class, in the language of the upper middle class.
The code switch.
Yeah, code switch, but while allowing me to keep my authenticity, because as was David was saying, what was so important to me, and I think what was integral for my own self-development and self-esteem, is that I brought my full self to Hotchkiss. I did not, there was a temptation to just, try to pretend that I was part of this culture that most of my classmates were part of. But I feel like the language was just so different that even if I tried to pretend, I would have looked like a fool. There's a book that I've just finished reading called The Privileged Poor, where they talk about, that language, people using as a verb. That was something that I had never had experience in Gary. But now that I have this dual language now, and also just dual focus, like Jody just said, that allows me to speak truth to power. So when I'm in rooms where people who, have never interacted with someone who's poor, or, they can count on one hand the amount of Black people, the amount of Black descendants of slaves, Black or immigrants that they've ever, that they've actually had a personal interaction with, I can bring that, my perspective, which includes all of that, to the table, and, help people be better leaders, consider blind spots that, they did not even realize that they have. And it helps me, it helps me think about things in different ways. And I do credit ABC with allowing me, into this boarding school experience. But for ABC, I would not have had that. I think I would have been okay, but the language of the wealthy, I would not have known.
We've got a few minutes left here, and I wanted to open it up. I don't know if we have any questions that might be coming through from some of the folks who are listening, or students. We could address that before we wrap up here tonight. So, of course, I'm looking over here on the side and have not seen anything come through yet. I'm just wondering if there's anything. We are living in an extraordinary time, a pandemic like the likes of which we haven't seen in a century, and at the same time, this intensity of social and civil rights discussion and engagement. I'm just wondering if there's anything from this experience over the last 6 months that has really stood out for all of you.
Just that, it seems that they're out in the streets saying we no longer want just Band-Aids or marginal, incremental fixes or papering over things without, really getting at any solutions. We're going to rattle the foundations of the status quo, And like you said, I was really too young in the 60s to know what was going on, but I kind of remember there's something there being something in the air like that.
Right.
That was here. And it was let's get down to the nitty gritty. Let's get down to foundational stuff. I think that's what inspired me. For example, to do this. The recent book I did, I realized that Michelle Alexander, when she says, most of what got us mass incarceration is low-level nonviolent drug offenders, I realized when I did some research that no, most of the people in prison are there for violent offenses and serious offenses. Only about 5 or 6% of them are there in state prisons, which is where 87% of the prisoners are for low-level nonviolent drug offenders. So we're going to need a radical overhaul of our moral framework, of our moral compass, if we're going to make deep cuts in mass incarceration. We're going to have to radically overhaul politics. We're going to have radically overhaul how we think of law even. And so it's one of those moments, I think. It invites us to think profoundly about basic social issues and not just settle for always incremental thinking along the way.
We do have one question coming through. Apparently, some folks have been talking about charter school. And what role do you think there is for charter schools in building equality? That seems to be right in Sharia and Debo's wheelhouse. So a jump ball for you two. Who wants to take that one on?
Geez, I think I would. I have some concerns about charter schools. I've seen a lot of charter schools be used as basically a profit generating entity for the people who own it or the industries that own it. And some have relied, not all, there are some really good ones, relied on this perception of, which schools are bad. And so, and without any, without really great data points, relied on that perception of these are bad schools to entice people to come to their schools with any type of experience or what have you. So, I think I wouldn't say that they're all bad. I don't know if I would say that they are a tool for equality. They are an alternative, but it really would depend on which charter network you're talking about, and really what they have proven to do for the students that they serve.
Debo, what are your thoughts? It's a highly fought issue. Years ago, it seemed as though it was like, oh, let's bring this concept of private school to the public schools, but now they've become fairly controversial in certain cities.
So the structural issues in education are such that there is no single method that's going to fix everything. Well, we need to invest in schools. We need to make sure that there's opportunity. We need to understand that public schools, are dealing with many populations that have concentrated a range of complex issues, from malnutrition to parents who are incarcerated, some substantial portion or some substantial fraction of students going to public schools in New York City, a non-de minimis number are homeless. And so you have to think about what are the circumstances of the children that are coming to schools, whatever the type of school, and what are the level of supports that they need to thrive. And there are some very good charter schools that discharge their mission and do great things. There are other charter schools that push kids out, that don't particularly discharge their mission any better than other schools, and that consume a lot of resources. And so I don't have a categorical response to that. I think that is there a role for charter schools? Perhaps there's an opportunity there, and it's very hard to tell parents who are upset with the schools that they've seen in their neighborhood over a long period of time not change, that they shouldn't have an opportunity to try something else. By the same token, I think that ultimately a better approach for society is if we were able to level up our public schools and to make those opportunities deliver on the promise of education, and to not allow the accident of zip code to be determinative of what educational opportunity you're getting. I mean, ABC is extraordinary because it does create an opportunity for students to be in a circumstance where they are surrounded by folks that have many advantages, teachers that often are very good, but not perfect, and to be on a trajectory of being college bound and bound for the top schools like many of us have, or all of us have gone to. But what we need to do is create that opportunity. We need to be thinking about how do we have an opportunity that can extend more broadly to folks and not just be a thing of such scarcity that we're robbing for small windows of opportunity.
Speaking of the schools that we all went to, someone asked, would any of you want your own children to go to an ABC school? I don't have children, but I would. So I think the great thing would be that I would be able to provide them that sort of context that Sharia talked about the fact that you might be very different from these folks, but you still want to be yourself. And I think A Better Chance does a lot more support with regard to that now than back in the last century when some of us were going to school when we were in the first few cohorts. But Jody, what are your thoughts? Would you send your child?
No question I'd send my boys to an ABC program if I could. The thing is, because I went to one, they don't need it like I needed it. I really needed it. I needed that intensive intervention. We had house tutors living with us, the house directors living with us, and it was, to really catch up to where the students were that I encountered when I got to ABC took a lot of work. It's like, so I had all three of my sons were crazy about, sports. My youngest wound up going to Division I Berkeley basketball. How did he do that? By doing what his other friends were doing. That's 300 shots a day, 20 minutes of dribbling a day, every day from 9th grade on. Well, that's what I got in A Better Chance. It was like every day you had drills, you had consistency, you had to work, get your game up to. By the time I got to Harvard, it actually wasn't. It was almost. I almost felt like
you had all the tools you needed.
Downhill a little bit. I was going uphill so long that I felt like a little downward slope, And that is that. Now, it's because of, in the ABC environment, it's culturally intensive, it's immersive, and it works. With my son, with my sons, I was able to give them a lot of advantages in grade school and middle school, so they didn't need as much intensiveness, intensive attention. And have been able to do fine. But I would, if I could, re-immerse them in that environment. Everyone could benefit from that environment.
Yeah, I would say the same. I don't have children yet either. I don't see, I've been blessed that I don't, that my children probably will have that bilingualness that I just talked about that, boarding school gave to me. But one of the things that I really like that I didn't appreciate until I was older, that you get from boarding school is this sense of independence. I would want my children to develop themselves at that age, 14 through 18, outside of being my child. I don't want them to go through Dallas or Gary or wherever we might be living and say, oh, my mom is a lawyer, which I see a lot of people who went to private schools, very great ones, do. They don't really have an identity and they don't develop themselves outside of their parents or who their parents are in the community, what have you. I would not want that for my child. And I think that Hotchkiss, the school that I attended, I've been on the board, they do an excellent job and are doing better each day of creating the social economic diversity that you will not, you don't really get outside of the private school, unfortunately. But I would want my children to understand who they are as individuals outside of their parents, along with other children who are doing the same thing, and understand, who they would connect with and align with without having to have the safety net or a helicopter parent nearby. I do not anticipate being, being that parent. Again, I don't have children yet, so it does remains to be seen, but I absolutely would. And
well, I think we're gonna leave it there and give you the last word, Debo. Sorry about that. We are coming up on the end of our program. Jody actually had to step out because he had another program. He's very busy promoting that book. More power to him. Thank you, Debo and Sharia, and thank you to everyone who submitted questions for the Q&A and for tuning in to this, the first session of Creating Leaders for a Lifetime Alumni Showcase. As I mentioned earlier, Creating Leaders for a Lifetime was created to address the lost revenue from the A Better Chance annual awards luncheon. Below this live stream is an online donation form. I'd ask you, if you can, to really make a donation right now, if you can, to A Better Chance. It's so important listen to the experiences that we've all had and how it remains a life-changing force for so many young scholars. As a financial news reporter and an alumni, I assure you that nothing pays better dividends than investing in the future of young, talented students like the Scholars of a Better Chance. So I encourage you all to register as well for Creating Leaders for a Lifetime Virtual Luncheon. That's scheduled for Friday, October 9th at 7 p.m., a very late lunch, unless you're on the West Coast, I guess. You can register for that event by clicking the navigation bar above and selecting Virtual Luncheon. So before we leave, I'd like to give our panelists one last opportunity to have a final word. Debo, since Sharia talked about going to school, I'll give you the last word tonight.
Well, ABC and the Fieldston School made a transformative difference in my life. I had the opportunity to join a bunch of alums this weekend for the memorial service of a classmate who died too young, and about 40 or so of us got together for 2 hours to remember our brother, Mark Fort, an educator in Los Angeles from Co-op City in the Bronx, who dedicated his life to creating opportunities for Black and brown kids, some of whom participated in the memorial and talked about the way in which he affected his life, their lives. And Fieldston really put me on a path to know that I could achieve academically and to open the doors that has created an extraordinary opportunity for me to keep trying to fight the good fight, or as John Lewis says, to get in good trouble. And ABC was a catapult and a change agent that helped that happen. And so I just want you to know that every time you give $1 to ABC, you're investing $1 in making America a more inclusive place, and a place that's closing that gap between our high promises and low practices. So let's do it.
Thank you so much. Do invest and do tell your friends. We're really in great need this year, especially, and scholars really need our support. Thank you to everyone who tuned in today, and we look forward to seeing you all at future sessions and our virtual luncheon on Friday, October 9th at 7 p.m. Eastern. Have a great evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.